Previously, we looked back on riding from the San Francisco Bay to Climax, Minnesota. If you haven't seen that part, I recommend checking it out. My goal for this first day back on the road was to make it to Theodore Roosevelt National Park at the west end of North Dakota. To get there, I was to ride west in basically a straight line from Grand Forks in North Dakota. This would be about 400 miles of calm and straight road. Other than my Garmin charger needing to be mended, this was a pretty mellow day looking at fields and plains from dawn to dusk. I made it to the park as the sun was setting and was glad to find a last-minute campsite in the park. I only caught a glimpse of the park on the way in, but was excited to see more the next day. Waking up, I had no clue what wild things the universe had in store for me on this new day. Riding deeper into the park, the scenery was truly otherworldly. Curvy, stratified rock formations popped up as far as the eye could see. To add to the drama, a storm started rolling in, darkening the land and making it take on a very apocalyptic look. I quickly put on my rain jacket and pushed deeper into the park, until I found a covered area to wait out the worst of the rain. My bike had been needing a good wash anyway. Right after pulling out of the parking lot, I caught a glimpse of the first bison herd. I don't think I'd ever really seen bison before, and seeing them from a bike with no doors or windows to separate me from them made the experience even cooler. However, shortly after this is when the day took a turn for the unexpected. Riding down the road and taking in the sights of the park, I ended up surrounded by a herd of bison. I'll put up a shitty sketch on the screen showing how it happened, but very simply, they were hidden by a small hill and a curve in the road, and by the time I passed the hill, I saw animals in front of me and behind me. As soon as I noticed this, I pulled to the side of the road to give them a wide berth and killed my engine to not spook them, but one of the bigger bison locked eyes with me and I knew things were about to get interesting. He started running towards me, and at that point I reactively started up my engine, did a U-turn and tried to quickly get as far away from this big bovine barreling towards me. However, the sound of the exhaust did not seem to please the rest of the herd, who started running as well. At this point, surrounded by running animals, I decided it was best to kill the engine and run out of sight of the charging bison. I made it up a hill and ducked my head, looking to see if this had calmed the animal. Luckily, he seemed to lose interest in me and rejoined the rest of the group. Myself, I was just happy I was not going to be in the news as one of those tourists that got gored by a bison, even if I do feel like I came pretty close. As the herd passed, I eventually got back to my bike and carried on exploring the park with a newfound respect for these wild animals. I hope I'll visit Theodore Roosevelt National Park again, and when I do, I'll be sure to keep my head on a swivel to not end up in that situation again. I got back on the road and started on my way south. As I did this, I noticed a sign on the side of the road indicating the center of the United States. I couldn't resist, and I made my way down a dusty gravel road which didn't seem to lead anywhere until I saw a pile of rocks on the side of the road with a cross on top of it and a sign claiming to note the true center of the nation. I thought to myself that if this were closer to a major town, someone would have found a way to build a store next to it and sell t-shirts and mugs, but seeing it this far out of the way, it seemed more authentic. And riding through the nation like I had been the past week, you start to realize how dispersed and empty it is for most of its surface. I saw many more chromed up bikes this time as I passed Sturgis, and I could feel the festivities had started. I hit a couple of the twisty Black Hill roads before pulling into the small town of Newcastle. I chose to find a cheap motel this time around, as the dark weather I'd seen that morning was looming, and I did not want to camp under the pouring rain. I was starting to really feel the miles, and the next day I decided to do a small detour to view Fort Laramie. I knew little about it except the name, having gone through high school outside of the USA. Reading its history showed it as a monument to the changing westward expanse of the United States, first used as a trading post and later a military post as the relationship between the settlers and the local Indian tribes deteriorated. I rode through fields and fields of cattle, each with signs encouraging me to eat beef every couple of miles, and finally gave in to the propaganda, having a stake in the little town of Walden. Apparently, it's the moose viewing capital of Colorado. Sadly, I did not see any, but feel like it could be a great goal for a future trip. I made my way up to camp at Dumont Lake Camp, close to the funnily named Rabbit Ears Pass, which was my favorite camping experience of the trip. Wildflowers of plenty different colors lined the path, and the whole area had a serene and inviting vibe. I pitched my tent and the bad weather that was following me all day finally came down. I'd never camped under a storm, and the experience was beautiful, with the tent lighting up and the sound of thunder landing around me. At the time, I was reading a book named The Conquest of Happiness by Bertrand Russell. In it, he talked about how happiness can come from accepting your situation and seeing the beauty in it, which seemed very relevant to my current predicament, with my tent starting to drip with rain. May have been wet, cold and stormy, but how incredible it is to be able to experience such things. The following day I felt a bit off balance all day, which may have been due to sleeping under the wet tent or just having been on the road for a while. I did a quick detour via Dinosaur National Park, where I saw a goofy rotund-looking dinosaur and 150-million-year-old bones. The visit to the park started to make the rest of the trip take shape and revealed a common theme throughout this trip: scale and perspective. Crossing the country never fails to cement the sheer scale of the nation, and seeing these multi-million-year-old bones belonging to creatures who decompose to create the fuel allowing me to power my motorcycle was a pretty crazy thought. The world was going to be okay. The dinosaurs aren't here anymore, but our planet still is. We might go extinct, but 150 million years from now, odd-looking aliens might take road trips to see our old bones and post about it on Space YouTube. I rode around the park and sat to take a breath next to a collection of petroglyphs etched into the rock 1,000 years ago by the Fremont people. Sitting on this rock and looking at the valley below, I tried to imagine what these Fremont artists were thinking when carving their images into the rock. Were they trying to be remembered, to be seen like a graffiti artist putting letters on a train car, or was this art for art's sake? I was still caught up in my existential thoughts as I pulled into Vernal, Utah, right as a terrible wind started blowing. I decided to duck into a cheap hotel and regroup. The next morning, I felt much better rested and could enjoy the multiple decorated dinosaurs of Vernal with fresh eyes. My goal for the day was to make it to the Bonneville Salt Flats, which I had been looking forward to since planning this trip months prior. Riding to the flats proved to be more of a challenge than expected, and the sideways wind kept the motorcycle at the angle for so long that my oil light came on. Riding the fully loaded FZ6 in these conditions was a bit of a challenge, but was all made worth it as I pulled in next to the Tree of Life erected next to the salt flats. I don't think I'd ever seen such a striking roadside attraction. While the tree itself wasn't too crazy, seeing it in the context of this vast expanse of white windy nothingness gave a really surreal feeling to the whole scene. I did not manage to get onto the section reserved for land speed records as the rain had turned the surface of the flats into sludge. I took a breath, looking at this infinity of white salt, and shuffled up the mountain to find some area to camp in. I met Matt, who helped me lift my bike that had fallen to the side as I was moving it around to set my tent up, and he shared stories of the Speed Week event and his life. I headed south to join Route 50 in Ely and noticed my bike was starting to get closer to displaying 66,666 on the odometer. Now this might just be a coincidence, but right before it did, I pulled into a rest stop where a trucker was broken down. He told me his company would take a long time to send a tow and that he'd been waiting there since the previous day. I gave him the book I was reading at the time, with the idea that if I were stuck out there in the sun, with no cell coverage and nothing to look at but desert, I'd want a philosophy book to pass the time. Hoping this would be enough to ward off the bad spirits, I crossed the mileage of the beast in the middle of the desert on a road oddly empty of cars. The sun was hitting hard in Ellie, and I decided to check out the railway museum which Matt had recommended the previous day. When someone you just met recommends a stop, you have to go. That's just the basic rule of a road trip. I highly recommend this stop if you ride in the area. I checked out the engine room, where a crew had just completed some crunch work on a steam engine to have it ready for display that day. I remembered that when I was a kid, I had the dream of driving and working on trains. Sharing this with the workers, they let me know that they might need some help and that I should apply for a job there. I said I'd consider it, knowing that once I'd get home, the possibility of applying and working on trains in the middle of Nevada would seem like a distant dream. But visiting the engine room and learning more about how steam engines work was a fantastic stop to get out of the midday sun and learn a bit about Nevada's trains history. At this point, getting back on Route 50 was starting to bring back memories of last year's cross-country trip. Except this time, I wasn't going towards the unknown, I was going home. Crossing Nevada with Highway 50 is always fun, as you have these miles of flat road, oftentimes with very few other vehicles around, and suddenly you come up on a range of mountains. The road gets twisty, you gain elevation, and then you come out on the other side back onto miles of flat desert road. For dinner, I stopped by Middlegate Station and ate probably the best fries of my life in a roadside bar with dollars plastered on the ceiling. I then set out to try to find a campsite. I followed a dirt road for miles before arriving at one of the sites I planned to camp at, but the energy was completely off. There was an open shaft down to God knows where in the mountain and the carcass of a dead deer on a ledge, and I chose to listen on the voice in my head telling me to get to the hell out of there. The sun was now setting fast, and I knew that I would be pitching my tent in the dark. Thankfully, I found another site a couple of miles down the road. While I did end up putting up my tent in the dark, I had a great view of the night sky and took some time to look at the stars before I fell asleep. I woke up to a view of a salt lake with nobody around for miles and perfect quiet. I took my time that morning, as I knew this was the last time I'd experience this for a while. I was right to enjoy silence while I could. I had a good time until Tahoe, where I realized that planning to go through Tahoe on one of the last weekends of summer was a really bad idea. Traffic, piles of people, noise. At this point, I was just trying to flee and make it home as quick as possible. As Route 50 became Interstate 80 in California, it also greeted me with bumper-to-bumper traffic, where I had the joy of lane splitting for a couple hours before making it home. This was a great trip. If you're listening to this and made it this far, you might be thinking of taking a long trip at some point in the future. All I can say is to stop overthinking it and just do it. My FZ6 with cloth luggage and a top case was enough to carry me on this trip. You don't need the biggest, latest, and shiniest, just something reliable enough and some bags to store your stuff in. I bring back memories from this trip that I hope to keep until I disappear in the sands of time. Crossing Bighorn National Forest, racing the sun to Gillette, snaking through the Black Hills and looking at fields for 2 days in the Dakotas, getting chased by bison and looking at stars in the desert of Nevada. Better writers than me have tried to describe the feeling of freedom you experience on the road, but nothing replaces actually going out there and experiencing it for yourself. I hope you're able to get out there soon, and I'll see you on the road.